The time period I'm going to talk about is around 1791. The topics I'm going to talk about in this video are Upper and Lower Canada, the Constitutional Act of 1791, the government structure which resulted from the Constitution Act, and the development of towns. So if you remember, after the American Revolution, when the Loyalists come up to Canada, they had to settle to the west of the area that was known as Quebec. And there was some unrest, they were not happy. So one of the things that happens around this time period is they decide to establish two separate areas. And they establish Upper Canada and Lower Canada. I know it seems kind of silly because Upper Canada is actually lower than Lower Canada. If you think about it from coming from colonization and coming from Britain, this is the lower portion and this is the upper portion. That's how I try to remember it. So this was, again, predominantly French-speaking, and this is predominantly the new Loyalists who have arrived after the American Revolution. So the Constitution Act of 1791 was in response to the British Loyalists wanting a government. They were used to the organization of the government in 13 colonies and having a voice, and they didn't like how the people in Canada didn't participate in their government. And so to satisfy both sides, the British government establishes the Constitution Act of 1791. So some of the things that are outlined in this act are Upper Canada and Lower Canada will both receive their own legislative assembly. So the governments will be separate. Upper Canada will have its own, Lower Canada will have its own. And both will have a legislative assembly which will be elected by the free men of those two areas. There will be a Governor General who represents the King. They will be appointed by the King. And the Governor General will reside in Lower Canada. And the Governor General has all the power. There will be a Lieutenant Governor who is the head of the government in Upper Canada, but the Governor General is a step above him and he will have the most power. So the Governor General in Lower Canada is in complete control. Both colonies will have an executive council and a legislative council. Those are appointed by the British government, and then both colonies will elect a legislative assembly. And they'll be in charge of taxes, and they'll propose bills, and sort of the local needs. Now, it was kind of a trick, because even though they gave them this legislative assembly, and they told them they had, some role in the government, they had really limited power. All the power really resided with the Executive Council, Legislative Council, and the Governor General. Here's the structure of the government. Now I've put up here, it's the government in Upper Canada. So remember, Upper Canada is that portion of the British Loyalists who have the Lieutenant Governor, who's second in charge to the Governor General. The Governor General is in Lower Canada, and he is the person that's truly in charge. So we have the British government over in Great Britain. And they appoint, the green arrows are appoint, they appoint a Lieutenant Governor for Upper Canada. The Executive Council and the Legislative Council are also appointed, and sometimes they're appointed by members of the British government, and sometimes the governors have some influence in who they are. Once you're in the Legislative Council, you're there for life. When you're in the Executive Council, you're there until the Lieutenant Governor says that they don't want you anymore. And it's sort of for obvious reasons, because the job of the Executive Council is to advise the governor. So if the governor doesn't like what you're doing, they just kick you off the council and appoint somebody else. The Legislative Council's job was related to bills and laws, and they would propose them, they would approve them if they were proposed by the Legislative Assembly. That was their role. The Lieutenant Governor's job, they represented the British government, and they did their best to uphold those laws and the British way of life. Now from the bottom, the voters, so any free men who owned property could vote for a representative in the Legislative Assembly. So the men that were in the Legislative Assembly were voted for by the people of Upper Canada or Lower Canada to represent them within this government. And again, they were involved with deciding about taxes and how that money would be spent. And they would propose bills for the Legislative Council to think about it and decide whether or not they were going to pass. And they were involved with local needs and local concerns. So you can see how it's organized. So the Constitutional Act of 1791 sort of made everybody happy. And it was a time where, we got over the conflict. The French and the British were going to live together. The 13 colonies, the American Revolution had happened. They were dealing with their independence and expanding and things at this time. And so it was time for Lower Canada and Upper Canada to do the same. So emergence of towns happened. With their own separate governments, they felt empowered, and they felt that they could really make decisions and that they could start to develop and expand their communities. So they started to establish corps and schools and hospitals and things like that. And so those institutional buildings. They also started to create a capital building in Upper and Lower Canada. And it was a time of union, and it was a time of growth. So it was a time where cultures that are very different and we've been trying to have biculturalism for so long, truly were able to live side by side in harmony.